So welcome everyone, thank you for coming. I'm really excited to welcome you to the panel on what is rhetoric. And this is part of a longer series we're going to be doing on states of rhetoric today over spring quarter of this year and the academic year next year. So I'll have a little bit more to say about some of the upcoming events at the end of this. But to begin with, we're going to have an interdisciplinary panel that's talking about the possibilities for rhetoric and scholarship in rhetorical studies across a range of disciplinary perspectives. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of the panelists. I'm not going to offer detailed introductions. I'm just going to let you know the panelists' names and the department they're coming from. And then as they each give their opening statements, they'll provide a fuller introduction to themselves and their scholarship and how that intersects with a range of ways that we can understand rhetoric today. So our panelists joining us today, first we have Vorris Nunley, who's joining us from the Department of Black Study. Study, new department that has only recently been approved here at UCR. Then we have Jennifer Merolla from the Department of Political Science, Latipa from the Department of Media and Cultural Studies, Pierre Keller from the Philosophy Department, Russin from the Film, Theater, and Digital Production Department, and Minch from my own home department of English. So now I'll turn it over and let the panelists each provide a fuller introduction to their work and an opening statement on rhetoric in their discipline. From there, I'll ask a few questions of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We can start at this end if that's okay with you both.
So, as you pointed out, I was part of the Black Studies Department, so I'm also very much a part of the English department too. So I have this kind of Janus-based relationship with my scholarship. I'm majoring in both literature and rhetoric, so rhetoric is one of my passions as well as my intellectual investments. So allow me to begin with two quotes. Can you hear me? Allow me to begin with two quotes. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. This quote is from an idiot quote of silent period signifying nothing. The second quote, we might concede, at the very least, that sticks and bricks might break our bones, but words and images will most certainly kill us. This is by Cortez Phillips from an essay called Mama's Baby, Papa's Lady. The rhetoric of her text has been under-theorized and overlooked in Black studies. But rhetoric is always overlooked anyway, so if I seem like I have an antagonistic attitude, I do. Any notion of rhetoric and Black study benefits from beginning with spellers. Black life is at stake here. It's not an abstract discussion. As already endangered in an anti-Black, anti-rhetorical world, Black study benefits not from a liberal humanist rationality, logic, or precision, but from rhetoric and flakiness. Because as Gladstone points out, and this is very important, reality exists after, not before. Reality exists after we apply our values, assumptions, ideologies, and deterministic strains, and not before. Black lives, they may matter, but Black life requires realities that provides possibilities. Finding rhetorical possibilities and emergent strategies so high you can't get over them, so wide you can't get around them, so low you can't get under them. Play that one. Yeah, you should be able just to hit play. So what we recognize in music, what it allows, I'm also arguing for it in rhetoric, right? And take note, this is vernacular. So you can find the vernacular theories, you can find theories in the mundane and the everyday. Rhetoric and Black study then provides a chance to dance, talk, and listen our way out of our constrictions. Rhetoric is important because it requires folks to listen, to opt out of what Sylvia Winter refers to as the coloniality of being. A wildness, a queerness, a funkiness that disorders desire and desires disorder. Not merely from the Platonian order of things, but from what Cedric Robinson conceptualizes as the terms of order. Order hidden appeals to civility, commonality, and common sense. You know, like last week's Senate meeting. A funkiness that allows Black folks and their allies to avoid the neoliberal wreckage on what Michelle Nunley refers to, excuse the language, as bad nigga boulevard. It's a critique of neoliberalism. Funkiness is understood by Toni Morrison and L.A. Stallings, and this is the gesture here. Funkiness as epistemological resilience, as making a way out of knowing, of being and becoming. Blackness as aliveness, Blackness as epistemic, epistemology as rhetorical. And there's been centuries of debate between philosophers and rhetoricians about that. So I can't win. Rhetoric and Black study, and this is we can see now on campus, ain't interested in keeping it real. In the afterlife of the enslavement, I reject such an assertion. Rather, as an activist department, Black study is invested in what Ursula K. Le Guin refers to as realism of a larger reality, or in Blackness as becoming. And becoming otherwise, which resists the fungibility of Black bodies and knowledges that may be necessary to Black maturity. Fungibility is the notion, like, when you take Black bodies, or Asian bodies, or feminist bodies, and just replace them because they're all doing the same thing, right? So it's flattens out that kind of conceptual sophistication under the guise of you're just doing cultural stuff. Not Blackness as a difference, but Blackness as a singularity. Resistance to such fungibility requires a fundamental shift. Therefore, Black study embraces radical imaginations. Let me be clear, being radical is not foremost in most of Black culture. Most Black folks are not radical. Okay? Rhetoric and Black study borrows not from Plato, who deployed the term to group together and denigrate his opponents, but rather from Aristotle, who understood rhetoric as persuasion. Rhetoric as the art of moving souls. Rhetoric and Black study samples from West Africa through the concept of nomo, the power of the word. And as Adisa A. Akelbulan argues about the importance of nomo to African philosophy and everyday Black life, nothing exists without nomo. So this is about the materiality of language, materiality of words, what they do in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Visceral theory then links rhetoric, visual, and linguistic. There's more than one kind of rhetoric, particularly in today's world, to the pre-symbolic. So rhetoric can be pre-symbolic. You don't know what that is. You enter a room and you know you've been talked about, or you know something's been going on. It happens in my family all the time. Rhetorical method and analysis in Black study are implicitly or explicitly anchored in only the concept around which that privileged, anti-sophistic, and the highly rhetorical anti-rhetoric Plato and IQ agree. The only thing upon which they agree is learning as unlearning. This is why Plato was published as such a valuable text for me, even as I talked about it. a critique from rhetoric. This leads folks in Black studies to start to study distinctive archives, new archives, unofficial archives, and outlaw archives to rethink the archival. Black study then relieves epistemic anxiety, smears at the reduction of Black study, the Department of Sheehy, feminist studies, indigenous studies, Asian American studies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It stirs up the notion that these are what is referred to as boutique disciplines. In the Senate meeting again. Against Plato, the sophist philosopher and teacher Pythagoras, positive that man said, is the measure of all things. The philosophers cannot really totally escape the rhetorical context of language, culture, and power. And America has hardly escaped its anti-Black innocence because its hostess pillars elucidates, I am a marked woman, a meeting ground for the investments and privations of the natural treasury of rhetorical wealth. In short, Black folks and the American imagination focus not as people or as subjects, but as tropes. Therefore, the importance finally of rhetoric. No rhetoric, no Black people, and no white people either. Thank you.
Hard to follow. So I'm Jennifer Merolla. I'm a political scientist. If I'm having social science, maybe on the panel. I guess in terms of kind of my own personal study, and I'll talk a bit about political science, I would say that probably my interest in rhetoric was not necessarily using the term rhetoric, but looking at it more through the lens of persuasion, which of course fits, very directly with the goals of rhetoric. Even back from when I was an undergraduate, some of my kind of really early work of thinking like, ooh, I might be interested in academia was looking at, I did a minor in art history, and I was looking at public art in the US context, kind of during World War II, as well as in Nazi Germany, and looking at using public art as a means of propaganda. And then since then, much of my work does look at the effect of different messaging and campaigns, how that might influence the general public, looking at the ways in which elites may frame messages to change public opinion on different issues. And so a lot of my work does deal directly with kind of looking at the effect, the ways in which elites try to use different strategies to persuade the public and the effectiveness of those strategies. But I will talk a little bit broadly just about in political science. We aren't usually trained specifically in rhetoric as you might find in other departments, but there are two bodies of literature that I think speak to questions related to effective means of communicating. One really focuses on political elites and their communication, and as you would imagine, a lot of that focuses on presidential rhetoric. So there's a great deal of work that's been done. I remember some of this when I was back in graduate school. Neustadt wrote a famous book that talked about the power of the president is the power to persuade, right? So this is beyond, say, formal institutional powers, but the way in which the president can kind of get Congress to do, at least in the US context up until this point, what he wants is, to persuade the public and basically go around the heads of Congress. And so this has been referred to as the rhetorical presidency, which there was a lot of scholarship talking about this shift over time. Kind of early in American history, this wasn't really the strategy. Usually the president was dealing directly with other political elites, but then learned over time, oh, if I appeal directly to the public, right, I can make some inroads and realize my agenda. And so there's quite a bit of work in presidential studies that looks at this transformation of presidential rhetoric over time. Other work has kind of looked, really deeply at, say, one president to examine their rhetoric and use of different strategies. And then another body of work may compare the rhetoric across, say, different individuals running for president at any given point in time. kind of one thing in this literature is that to note is that the methods used kind of vary quite a bit. So some individuals do a really in-depth analysis of different speeches. So that might be a State of the Union address, an inauguration speech, public addresses. Others may do a more quantitative analysis, kind of coding the content of speech to draw inferences. And so that's kind of one general approach, but I'll note that, you know, a lot of these studies vary quite a bit in terms of what aspect of speech they are looking carefully at, right? Some may look at kind of how much do presidents emphasize particular issues in their speech. Others might focus on the nature of the delivery. You know, are they using kind of more simplified language to appeal to the masses or kind of more elitist language? In some of my own work in this kind of arena, I've done work on charismatic rhetoric and the extent to which different political candidates use either feminine or masculine elements of charismatic language. And that's kind of collaborative work with someone in organizational psychology that focuses on leadership studies. So that's kind of one strand of work in political science. It's not as prominent as maybe it used to be a few decades ago, focusing on presidential rhetoric. The second strand of work is kind of really alive and well and flourishing in the discipline, and that focuses much more in the area of public opinion and communications. And here really the focus is on what types of communication lead to changes in public opinion, changes in evaluations of political leaders. And there's so many different areas that folks focus on. So some look at the way in which providing information can shift opinions in a policy area, whether that's providing novel information that people may not already know that's not in the public space. They may look at the kind of stronger effect of negative information in the public space versus positive information on attitude formation. There's been a lot of work that's trying to look at, are there any strategies of providing information that may counter misinformation or disinformation, as you would imagine in today's political climate? And then also, what type of information might elites provide that could counter partisan biases? What we know from a lot of literature and public opinion these days is that kind of cues that we take from party leaders have such a strong effect on people's opinions that moving them away from that can be quite challenging. So there's a really active research agenda on that. Another area that's really prominent is looking at things like the way in which an issue might be primed in public debate and how that affects the ingredients that people bring into their opinions on different issues. We look a lot at the way issues are framed. So some of my work in that area looks at the way in which we frame issues around undocumented immigration and how that affects policy attitudes. We also look at things like moral framing and moral reframing and how that influences attitudes. And I think in this area, while much of the work on presidential rhetoric really focuses much more on the text itself, in this other area of work, there's also questions that look at the effect of different emotional content in political speech. Things like visuals that are accompanied with text or speech, as well as music that may be in the background of something like, let's say, a political advertisement. There are studies of, the effect of different types of ways of presenting information, graphically, non-graphically. So there's a lot of work that's done on those topics. And the methods in this kind of area of work tend to rely a bit more on survey experiments or lab experiments because they're usually focused much more centrally on the reactions by the public. And so usually they'll have people exposed to different types of information, and then they measure their opinions after the fact to look at whether there's any difference. And as you would imagine, a lot of the work does find pretty strong effects of things like framing and information on public opinion, but maybe less so than you would find a few decades ago. Right, and part of that is related to partisanship just having such a strong effect on people's opinions in today's era. So that's all I kind of wanted to just give a general outline of what we do.
Hello, my name is Latipa. My background in rhetoric is really from the perspective of visuality. The thoughts I'm going to share with you today are actually a kind of preview of a talk I'll be giving in full in the same room on March 10th from 1 to 3 p.m. So just a plug for that. I've been making films for the past 25 years. To be a filmmaker is a great privilege. I've had the chance to enter into the worlds of so many. It is because of the deep sense of accountability to all the people who have let me into their worlds that I am driven to deconstruct the foundations upon which our understandings and practices of media are built. I want to listen to what lies below the ground to usher in new possibilities for media formation specific to local needs. My drive for accountability is also the sense of becoming an I that is many, imbued with not only the stories of those who have let me into their lives, but the openness, generosity, will, courage, and luminous, unshakable survivance that has been at the core of each of these relationships. Central to my work, I'm asking, how do we develop media practices that can attend to the care, nourishment, and well-being of communities in the face of the increasing concentration of power in the hands of the few, the new and old forms of dispossession that arise with the climate crisis, and the consistent colonization of knowledge that leaves us in perpetual states of forgetting. This is because I want a media that empowers people, animals, rivers, humans and non-humans and more than humans alike. I want a media that nurtures communities and that builds movements for everyone's liberation. I want a media that inspires healing, teaching, learning, sharing, and deep reciprocity. I want a media based in relationships, intimacy, and understanding. In other words, I want a media that one rarely, if ever, finds. For above ground, in the realm of what is visible, all we see, all we learn about, all we are exposed to, all that is available, even in the circles that are supposedly the most progressive or socially invested, are forms of media practice lodged in the positivist legacies of imperialism, in liberal ideology, in globalized non-governmental industrial complexes, and in normalized practices of extraction. What most of the media that we are exposed to offers, even if it is in the guise of social transformation, is actually a circle of violent colonial repetition. The colonial repetition is not just a matter of representation or a critique of the content of the images that are produced. Rather, it is the positions into which we are interpolated and the possibilities that arise out of where we are placed. What is both possible and impossible in the space of living. Navigating the simultaneous and contradictory proximity, so close as to be identical and so far as to be impossible, is what I argue as the visuality of liberalism. Liberal ideology is actually at the core of most discourses concerning socially engaged or community engaged media practice. In such discourses, media is the possibility for the amplification of unjust social conditions, the possibility of raising consciousness so that more people might know about the problem, and trusting that such awareness of conditions might be addressed. This, I assert, is a liberal fantasy grounded in long legacies of positivism and colonial ideology, all made into a neat package, not through its offensive representation, but actually through the positions it defines in the field of vision, in its modes of address, and in the way it forecloses the kinds of relationalities that might actually make change possible. I understand that representation is only the outermost surface of a problem that is better understood by thinking about the conditions of production that allow images to come into being, the discursive frameworks through which meaning gets made and remade, the function of images to produce material effects, and the questions concerning to whom such images belong. These dynamics for me are what it means to be engaged with the so-called visual rhetoric. Ultimately, I understand the problem of representation as an ideological ploy to stop us from thinking about the brutal materiality of media making, the ways in which images reinforce reinstall, and even produce the very power of the forces we think we are fighting. The vision that I'm working toward is for media to learn from, and so this is actually what will become expanded upon in the talk a week from now, that media must learn from mycelium. For in this fungal structure is the possibility of mutuality, interdependence, interconnection, memory, intelligence that's collective, and the circles of renewal that are essential to facing the immense planetary challenges of our moment, challenges that will only become exponentially exacerbated in the years ahead. And this is where the collective work that I'm a part of with the Memory Resistance Laboratory comes in. The Memory Resistance Laboratory is an initiative to activate liberatory and reparative futures through memory work. And there are 6 intertwined threads that form the mycelium of memories, a network of mutually constitutive processes that animate our practice. And those are a kind of formation of media ecology rather than media center, living archives, which relates to what Vorris was talking about, the desire for media to contribute to intergenerational healing, popular education, accountability to communities, and to have experimentation as an ethic, not just as a style. So Memories strategically aims to make memory a place where we can develop circles of renewal that prioritize community engaged production. We co-create projects in and with communities, and our practice of memory work emerges through 3 intertwined areas of research. And those areas are media-based cultural projects, publications, and pedagogies of unlearning. And these areas form what we understand as a media ecology grounded in accountable and ongoing relationships in and with communities.
Yeah, so I approach the relationship between rhetoric and philosophy, I guess, from my background. I started off as a student of Gadamer, of Henrich, of Teunissen in Heidelberg when it was great. And I then went to Columbia, where I studied with Danto, Goyce, Larmore, and Parsons. So there was once I got to Columbia, everything having to do with French philosophy was regarded with scorn and derision. Even though Columbia had the reputation for being open to this. My attitude was never that. I would travel to Yale to sit in on talks by Derrida, and I found them really interesting. So my general approach is sunk into history. I start from the Greeks, but I also try to think of philosophy truly as world philosophy. So I've never been disinterested in Islamic philosophy, Indian philosophy, and Chinese philosophy. And I think all of that needs to be integrated. So that's actually how I approach the things that I'm expert at. That ranges from Kant through Hegel to Cassirer, Heidegger, and post-structuralism. In all of this, I'm engaged in a general project that hooks up with the age-old controversy between rhetoric and philosophy. It's already old in Plato's Republic, right? As he says. Throughout the centuries, this comes back actually in all philosophical culture. So this isn't just limited to, say, the Renaissance in Italy or 20th century philosophy and literary culture. It appears in India, it appears in Islam. I'm not quite familiar with the details of Mayan interchanges in that respect. What I know of the Mayas is mostly cosmology, but I'm sure that those same debates occurred there. In philosophy, there's a tendency to think that philosophy can achieve a God's eye perspective. It takes on the role already beginning in Aristotle, really, of what Heidegger liked to call ontotheology, where the prime conception of being is taken to be God, and then to understand grounding relations, you always turn back to that conception of what is truly fundamental. Now, I believe that most philosophy today is completely locked into that paradigm. There's a lot of talk in analytic philosophy, for instance, of grounding relation. People are looking for what is ultimately real and then trying to trace everything back to that. So I consider that a fundamental error. And I take it that the philosophical tradition with which I identify, namely the Marburg school of Ernst Cassirer, Paul Nahrtorp, and Hermann Cohen, but also those who were influenced by it very essentially, like Martin Heidegger and Hans-Georg Gadamer, they all take the starting point of Kant's philosophy, actually, to raise the question, what do we mean by being in general, rather than simply assume that we can categorize things in terms of some fundamental set of objects. Now, once you raise the question, what do we mean by being, then you're actually in a position to challenge the view that philosophy can or ought to attain to a God's eye perspective. So I consider that goal in philosophy to be incoherent, and I believe I can offer arguments for that, which I'm not going to show here. But once you've given up on this idea of a perspectivalist conception, then it's a lot easier to allow for different perspectives of different philosophers, different cultures, different disciplines to not only coexist, but each to have their own contribution. And that's, in fact, what some of the great German and French philosophers of the 20th century tried to do. In particular, that's what Ernst Cassirer's task of looking at all of the arts and the sciences and mythology and all of these things and different cultures as each making their own individual and different contribution to a whole which is never to be understood in terms of one fundamental way of looking at things. And that prepares the way for an appropriation of what the French, in the wake of the work of the artist, intellectual, and thinker Pierre Klosowski referred to as the theory of the simulacrum. So in French philosophy, from the 60s, really, but this starts much earlier with people like Bataille, a new conception is foregrounded, namely to rethink things in terms of a pattern of simulations or simulacra to which there's no corresponding reality. So we have these different perspectival looks, but those perspectives don't correspond to anything independent of it. Now, one danger of that view is, as it's often interpreted, it means that everything floats free and nothing has any significance. So I push back on that and claim that you can actually develop this art theory of simulacra, because the notion of a simulacrum actually comes from Roman art, where it's used to describe statues. So you can think of the world in terms of these different structural constructions, but some constructions are more illuminating than others. And so it's not all or nothing. In fact, my claim is that especially in analytic philosophy, the tendency is to think that you either have relativism, where anything goes, or you have realism and absolute truth. And usually that notion of absolute truth is bought at no cost. So lots of contemporary analytic philosophers believe that objectivity is simply what you grab when you use their apparatus of direct reference. And I find that philosophically indefensible, and it's pre-Kantian in my view. So I want to return to the true Kantian and Hegelian roots of thought, and that's the way I see my own project, looking at the arts, at the foundations of mathematics, physics, and agency, and these historical figures as well.
Okay, thank you. That was a deep dive. My name is Robin Russin. I'm from the Department of Theater, Film, and Digital Production. And two things. One is I'm not the most qualified member of my department to be here. Annika Spear, who has been redefining public speaking across the UC system, and I think is probably going to continue to do that here at UCR. I'm a little confused why she's not here and I am, but I'm here to fill in. The other thing, of course, is that our department tends to be more practice-driven than research-driven. That isn't to say we don't have very deep researchers such as Reed Chaffee-Berg. And one of the things that I would say fits into this conversation is our production, which is on, or was just on, of The Widow of Valencia, where Arit, along with Barbara Fuchs at UCLA and another team, decided to retranslate this Renaissance-era Spanish play, including Spanish and English, and to kind of reintroduce it as a classic. It's really quite a unique thing that we did in the department here with that play, as a way to expand the idea of what the classics are, what the classic means. This idea of inclusivity is sort of a catchphrase, but how do you do it? And so our department, really quite some time ago, defined our mission as telling the stories that have not been told so far. So we've tried to distinguish ourselves from schools that tend to be more directly industry related, that is to say the film industry or the entertainment business, and more on focusing to address the stories that our particular students have that have not been told before. That is the mission of our department. And we see slowly, painfully, that the industry is beginning to move along in that direction. When we have someone like Michelle Yeoh talking about everything everywhere all at once, saying, at last I finally get to be myself. You know, that issue of representation is very important in the way we teach our classes. So for instance, I have a movie right now that's actually was just in a festival in Hollywood, where the star was a young man with cerebral palsy. And the purpose of this movie was not just to be didactic, but to show the humanity of people living with disability. And it's a love story. It's a story of overcoming disability. But the point of the film is to use the tool we have to open up and enlarge the conversation. Now, you know, there's the old famous quote, no one knows if it was Sam Goldwyn or who said it, but if you want to send a message, call Western Union, right? So we have to be careful about that, in that if we're just being didactic, if it's just a manifesto we're putting out, then people are going to ignore it, or we're preaching to the converted, preaching to the choir. So it has to be something that is engaging and hits us at an, dare I say, at an entertainment level. This is where we run into a lot of the difficulty of language, whether you're, follow Chomsky's idea, just sort of this instinctive understanding of language. Language is a tool that can be very useful and also very harmful, whether it's Hitler delivering a speech or Trump coming up with these little sort of nicknames that he gives to people that somehow stick. There's an enormous emotional power in how we can use and abuse language. And I think that's a very interesting thing. And what you were just talking about in terms of social science, I keep wondering, why do we on the left not have a Frank Luntz who's as good as he is to help us message, right? So, but to get back to the point of our department, one of the things that is one of the guiding principles of how we teach what we teach is that story is the essential way we have to understand our place in the world, to understand who we are, what we are, and to connect what are otherwise a random series of incidents and events in our lives into a narrative, into something that has some kind of coherent meaning. Now, that also means that we have to define those meanings. We have to come up with the thematic purpose of the stories that we're telling. And sometimes we can be unreliable narrators. The idea that what we're telling is true is asymptotic. We're never going to get to the truth. And often we veer quite far away from it, depending on how we narrate the story and through whose eyes we're telling it. So rhetoric is a very flexible thing. One of the things that, as storytellers, our purpose is to communicate. We've talked about this idea, others have talked about this idea of persuasion. Storytelling is persuasion of a different kind. It's an emotional persuasion. It's a way to reach people on a level that they can kind of either relate to or admire or live through an experience without suffering consequence, such as in a horror film. There are ways of that we communicate with each other through story and then talk about it afterwards. The old cliche of the water cooler is one of the most powerful examples of how our form of storytelling affects society in general. People are going to talk about Crazy Rich Asians and was it a great story? What all the complexity around it. Well, it's just a basic rom-com and they stuck some Asians in it in a pretty place. Is that really representation? All these kind of conversations begin to come up. And so our department is really driven by this idea of how do we make story purposeful and meaningful? When I teach a class, I usually in screenwriting talk about, for example, if you're religious and you go to Sunday Mass or you go to the high holidays, you're hearing stories. You're hearing things that purport to be the truth about the universe as that religion is explaining it. Is it the truth? Well, it's the truth you've chosen to accept or at least to engage with. So there's religion, every aspect of what we believe is affected by story. So one of the other things I do, because I also teach Shakespeare studies, is I like to show the speech, and never done better than by Marlon Brando, the Friends, Romans, and Countrymen speech from Julius Caesar, because it's an amazing example of how people can be moved one way and then another, and then another, and then another, by the sheer force of argument, by the emotional power of how you present a concept. And it's just a brilliant explanation of how people can be moved to jump off a cliff, because the power of the rhetoric is so intense. And you think about even going back and you're talking about the classics, but even in the Iliad, there are great examples of rhetoric in literature there, where you have Agamemnon trying to sort of stupidly trying to get his soldiers up for war by saying, well, let's all go home, and hoping they'll all say no. And instead they all run for the ships. And then it's up to Odysseus to run, no, we didn't mean that. So in the earliest forms of our literature, we see how rhetoric has the ability to move and to move crowds, to move whole societies. And as filmmakers, as storytellers, as playwrights, that's something that we are aiming to do. So for example, one of our colleagues in our department, Kirby Hines, was just commissioned by the Ford Theater in DC to write a play that'll be part of their season next year. It's a really great honor. And he is writing about, based on a true story of a Black magician. It's called Black Box. And he is using that story as a way to demonstrate the trap that Black intellectuals and really Black society was in, and the attempt to break free through the metaphor of breaking out of the Houdini box. So he's using theater as a way to express his own experience and the experience that, as he sees it, of the Black experience in America. It's very interesting to have heard the initial comments here, because I've been listening to a podcast called The Plot Thickens, which Turner Classic Movies has produced about Pam Grier, who is a Black actress who sort of came of age during the Blaxploitation era. But this podcast series is about the evolution of how she saw her representing the Black body in film and in culture, and how that changed from the 70s through to the the current time. So there's a lot. I mean, rhetoric's a very big, almost impossibly big topic to try to nail down. The movies have immense power. The whole argument that's still ongoing from the 80s movie of Wall Street, the greed is good speech. I mean, that's still relevant. It's still part of the public conversation. So, how do we use these tools to get across something that's closer to our perception of the truth? And I'm very reluctant to use that word of truth and absolute truth. I'll never forget, there was a series called The Ascent of Man that a man named Jacob Bronowski produced based on his book. And there's a thing where he goes out into the mud of the pond at Auschwitz and he digs up a handful of the ashes that are there. And he says, this is what happens when people feel they own the truth, or something to that effect. That the idea that you own the truth, that you have the right to know God's mind, is what allows catastrophe and genocide to happen. Because if others don't believe as you do, they're dispensable because you own the truth. So how does rhetoric address those issues, and how do movies address those issues? So some of it is how we frame the story. Some of it is the psychology of how we are telling the story. Is it suspense? Is it surprise? Are we manipulating emotion? And of course we are. As filmmakers, we're always manipulating emotion, but to what end? And is it dishonest? Is it dishonest manipulation? For instance, 50 Shades of Grey, complete misappropriation of emotional manipulation. Very popular though, very seductive. And that's one of the challenges of rhetoric that we see as well. How do we tell a good story? But how do we also avoid telling stories that lead people to the wrong conclusions? So with that, I would say that I think that film and television and YouTube is the great rhetoric machine. It's taken over from Twitter because Elon just pretty much destroyed Twitter. But I mean, even the argument about Twitter, that 140 or 280 characters can change the course of history. These are enormous issues, and and for us in film, theater, and digital production, it's how do we tell the stories that best reveal the truths of the world as it is right now, and specifically as our students are experiencing. That's all I know.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Mark Minch de Leon in the English department. I also work in Indigenous studies. And so I'm actually going to start with this idea by Adrienne Marie Brown. And the emphasis is on presence, not preparation, which means I'm here. So I don't have the preparation. And so I think what I'm going to do is just maybe compose a little bit in relationship to some of the work that I do. I'm a little bit hesitant to sort of represent the English department and speak about, what it is that we do in relationship to rhetoric, but I could definitely give kind of a sense of how I think about And so, I mean, I think the first thing I want to kind of start with, you know, this, like one of the things that I think is a theme about what the emphasis on rhetorical analysis is, you know, the material, social, political sort of situation of speech and text. But you know, from an Indigenous studies perspective, one of the things that we have to do immediately is begin to ask, like, which languages, right? Like, why is it that we are speaking English here in this particular space? The space that has been historically a space of tribal communities gathering together, as well as like, what are the limits of language in relationship to it being a human sort of endeavor, right? Like this idea that there are sort of other ways of thinking about what constitutes language. Then how can you start to think about an Indigenous rhetoric that would be able to actually encapsulate this idea that language is across not just, you know, different situations between different humans, but across different species, even across, and you know, this is also, I think, a kind of rhetorical move, but like a lot of like really critical thought in Indigenous studies operates through what Gerald Visner calls a trickster hermeneutics, right? This idea of sort of inverting things, using different kind of tactics in order to like really upend the situation and sort of expose the grain, right? To show like what's actually going on there. And so, you know, I think like those kinds of things get us to this sort of question that rhetoric can actually be something that's really fundamental about the conditions of us to be able to have these kind of conversations, right? So, so with that, like my interest in looking at, working with rhetoric from an Indigenous studies perspective, oftentimes looks at knowledge production, right? Like within this context where we are right now in the university, you know, there are real material sort of consequences. There's a real material sort of conditions and situation that lead to knowledge being produced in certain kinds of ways, right? And so if you really get into the history of how that is done, you can start asking things like, okay, well, when we talk about inclusion, say, of Indigenous thought, what are the conditions for that to even be possible? Like, how is it that Indigenous forms of thinking have been excluded over time, right? You know, the very idea that, you know, say like human and non-human relationships, that those as important social and political sites of governance, that those are something that have been understood to be, you know, regarded as belief, or to be, you know, regarded as an object of study through things like, you know, ethnography. Like once you actually see the kind of history of how that particular situation has occurred, then you realize that the entire sort of like direction of how we produce knowledge continues to reproduce that situation. And it's not just a matter of inclusion then, because in order for then something like a claim about those kinds of social relationships to be included, it has to operate within the terms of the inclusion itself. It has to operate in the terms of how knowledge gets produced. And so it gets really down to this kind of fundamental level of like what constitutes knowledge. And I agree, I think, you know, rhetoric as, you know, a form of analysis, as many of my panelists have been talking about, is something that is about persuasion, right? But that also sort of includes not just the agency or the movement, but it also includes a kind of sense of like how to undo things, like how to actually go in and start to think through different kinds of ideas of what negation might be like. Like how do we actually start to sort of move beyond a kind of subtler colonial sense of like what constitutes common sense, in order to see, you know, the possibility of actually changing the situation for speech to take place, or for text to take place, or for social relationships to take place. And then I'll just, I think what I want to say here is that some of the things that have come out in this panel that have really sort of incited some thought in it, is how the kinds of differences between, you know, say vernacular speech versus, you know, types of, you know, more sort of institutional, more sort of, you know, understood to be authoritative types of speech, that I think like something that Vorris was pointing to about, you know, the institution itself reproducing forms of anti-Blackness. I think there's something about how the exclusion of these types of speech also reproduce certain kinds of colonial situations that, really make us question about what the boundaries of the institution are, right? Like how it is that, knowledge itself has certain kinds of authority. Like what rhetoric does is it gives us a sense of like how power and speech sort of are intertangled with each other in order to continue to reproduce these social relationships of power. And so for me, working in Indigenous studies, I also have to begin, and I'm really interested specifically in what constitutes California Indian studies, which is, to put it lightly, a pretty complex field. And I'm saying it here, here we are in California, but like, the situation for California Indian studies is one where it's been about the study of California Indian people, right, as objects of knowledge. And so I think what's so exciting to me about rhetoric is it's a discipline that almost, like, to me, it like avoids the possibility of itself becoming an object of analysis. I know one can do, sort of rhetoric studies. I know one can come to understand, rhetoric in its history and its kind of social implications. I know those kinds of things can be done. But I've always been interested in a type of rhetoric that actually sort of moves into the space of, of how it can actually inhabit. And I'll just kind of point to the fact that, like, I went to the rhetoric department at UC Berkeley for my PhD, and there was this kind of like, I don't know if it was a joke, I don't know if it was serious, but there was this kind of sense that, like, that you could do anything, right? Rhetoric of X. And so literally it was almost like Trojan horses. Like they kind of imagined creating graduate students that could go into any discipline because it was an adisciplinary space and provide a kind of possibility to understand the conditions of how that one particular discipline or field or whatever it is was able to produce knowledge. And so I don't know if I necessarily agree with that entirely, because it feels, I don't know, there's something really interesting about the reproduction of that idea. But there is something about this idea that rhetoric is something not necessarily to own or to know or to study as an object in itself, but it is in some sense a kind of praxis, right? And so, like, then, when you connect that to this idea that, going back to your notion of story, that one of the things that, becomes really important is understanding how meaning gets produced, but it's meaning that's produced within a certain kind of political, a certain kind of social situation, in an institutional space with a very particular kind of history. Then you get to understand, like, what kind of stories are being able to be understood as meaningful, which types of stories are going to be, for instance, excluded as something that could be understood as maybe something that could be understood as, part of entertainment, right? And so if you look at, for instance, a lot of Indigenous stories, there is the sense that they kind of work outside of the space of meaning, and they've been interpreted and materialized as sort of forms that become points of data or become points of analysis in order for the sort of building up and accumulation of the type of knowledge. And so I'm really interested then in, like, how rhetoric gives me the sense of being able to, like, understand the history of that, how that happens, what the kinds of effects are, and how it is that one can begin to intervene in that process to give story itself back some kind of sense of praxis, right? Some kind of way to begin to see it, almost fundamentally as an anti-colonial form. And so that's, just a little bit about kind of my understanding of rhetoric in a slightly idiosyncratic way in relationship to California Indian studies. But again, I can't really speak to maybe how English and the English department relates to it, but it's a pretty radical practice, I think. And so it's something that I continue to go back to.
Thank you, everyone, for, like, such a rich conversation and so many different perspectives coming up. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of synthesis that our panel's entitled, what is rhetoric, but really what's coming out of the conversation is, like, the questions we're really asking about, like, what does rhetoric do, right? It's doing something in the world. It's the conditions of possibility for sociality itself, for our politics, for ethics, even for the conditions of survival, who's surviving, who's thriving. So this question of persuasion is deeply connected to all our disciplines, even English, but I'm not gonna talk too much about English right now, but I think a lot of the things that were mentioned on the panel resonate with what we do in the English department, include in terms of a study of kind of power knowledge formations. And so I think this panel is really speaking to the importance of humanities scholarship in the world today and social sciences scholarship, but that we're not actually doing different things than social sciences in many ways. We're using different methods, but we're all seeking to understand the world and how power and possibility function within that world and how we might intervene in those processes. So before I open it up to questions from the audience, I just wanted to create a space to see if any of the panelists wanted to say anything in response to other panelists.
I think there's one thing one of the things you were talking about that I think is really interesting, which is just this idea of the nature of language itself. And are we, and this is always an issue in translation, which is when you translate something, fundamentally alter it, because it can never be rewritten. And then there are languages like Linear A that haven't been translated, they can't seem to be translated. And it seems to me that a lot of things like, when we talk about animal languages, we're now discovering that crows and others have fairly elaborate linguistic systems. But how do they relate to ours? How do we connect with them? And on a larger thing of how do we exist on this planet as life forms? How does that communication give us the potential for survival? I think that's a really fascinating thing that you're working with, and that the Native American experience of the world as the vehicle to get there is pretty fascinating, actually.
Well, and operating through an English one that's never just in English, but there's multiple English.
Yeah.
And
We're two
really-
countries separated by a common language, right? The old Stephen Spender thing.
Yeah. And I just kind of want to note, I've been doing some work on teaching as well. Some students are here. Mabel McKay, who was a homo vascular weaver, also a sort of healer and dreamer, part of the Bulmaru sort of, and there's this beautiful moment in a book by Greg Saris where he's describing Mabel McKay at Stanford giving this talk in front of students and faculty and staff, and someone asks if plants speak, and her response is, yeah, I guess, kind of like this, that's possible, it makes sense, yes, they probably do. And then someone followed up the question was well, what do they say? And her response was why would I listen, right? And so there's a kind of idea about one, not wanting to sort of generalize these kinds of questions and these kinds of conditions. And rhetoric also gives the sense to me of the very specific circumstances, in this case, of which social relationships matter for this survival that you described. And then also in relationship to the question of translation, when you talk about someone like Mabel McKay, she had 6 indigenous languages, right? Because that is, California, culturally, politically, has always been an incredibly diverse space, but, with indigenous communities, you had to know multiple languages in order to just get by. And so then how do you begin to think about English and the structure of English and its limitations, the subject-object kind of emphasis, the agency, and all of that, when those other languages are so nuanced around those social relationships? And it's been reduced down to her having to communicate in this language because of the history. And so I think there's something too about what is there and not there, and the need to try to think through that relationship that wouldn't just be a question of how do I translate the meaning, right? It's a social thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'll open it up to any questions that might come from the audience.
Thank you all for your presentations. I got a couple of specific questions for specific people. I'll start with Vorris. At one point you said that we live in an anti-Black, anti-rhetorical world. Could you explain what you mean by the second? In what sense do we live in an anti-rhetorical world? I wasn't sure what you have in mind there.
The typical, when you speak about rhetoric in common amongst them, as the truth, you speak rhetoric. So rhetoric is always kind of demonized in that way. But this is interesting.
There's anti-truth or something other than that it's not being about truth.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
But it's not even about having a human relationship to the truth. But as philosophers used to say that certain kinds of analytical philosophers would say that the sophist about winning the argument had nothing to do with truth. That was trained both how to win an argument. I myself as a sophist, because I tell my students, some of them are here, I don't believe in the universal truth, but I act as if I do, I talk as if I do, right? Because rhetoric is necessary to have a certain kind of credibility. But this is fascinating, right? Because I think the world will become more anti-rhetorical when rhetoric becomes more and more important. It's precisely at that moment that it becomes less more and more rhetorical. So David, and Matt Jerry Harvest wrote this book called Persuasion. The front lines for the fight for the hearts and minds of democracy for those who are excluding democracy, let us what we want. But for those who are, what does it mean to champion persuasion in an era of polarization? We are quite convincing. But the lifeblood of any society is persuasion, changing other people's minds to change things. Right, so in speculative fiction, I totally Baylor talks about the God is turning. Adaptation is everything. But America is suffering a crisis of faith and persuasion, doesn't believe democracy, and it's part of the suffering this. So that's what I meant by that. But for me, it becomes more and more significant. For example, I think that Donald Trump is a brilliant rhetorician. I also like the one that Panelists said, or someone in the audience said, why doesn't, I think you said, why doesn't the left have a right on? Because the left is working on still talk about the truth of facts. Not it doesn't work for most people. Like, what is the story that forms those facts?
Yeah.
But no.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I got a question
You
for
got-
Pierre too.
Of course.
So you began by talking about the argument between rhetoric and philosophy. And then you sort of moved to what I take to be your cosmopolitanism, where philosophy should incorporate many different points of view. So what's the connection between that and the argument between rhetoric and philosophy? Sort of your remark shifted.
Right.
If you could
Yeah.
comment on the.
And I realized that actually after the fact, so.
Here's your chance to.
Right. So, yeah, in Plato, there's this idea that rhetoric and the arts in general, painting especially, are inherently perspectival. They never transcend perspective. They never transcend the public sphere and the desires and emotions that are manipulated by the public, and then manipulate even the politicians who are trying to manipulate them, but also the artists in reproducing this, and the rhetoricians reproduce the demands of the public. So that's really key to Plato's view that in the public sphere, everybody is connected together by an illusion of what's in their self-interest. And nobody is concerned with the interest of the whole community. And Plato thinks, and I take it that this is central to the philosophical tradition, especially that beginning with Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, and so on, that what we need to do is to reorganize our whole desire set, our emotions, our reason, so that we are engaging with others and not seeing our own self-interest in opposition to that of others. Now, once you do that, you're in a position to hold on to a fundamentally perspectival way of looking at things, but not a perspectival way of looking at things that's dislodged from the common good and the common interest. So in a way, what I'm saying is that the usual way of setting this up, where you have rhetoric that gives you persuasion and appearance and emotional attraction, juxtaposed to reason and absolute truth and all that, that's a false opposition. And what we need is a conception of reason that's fundamentally perspectival, but that also transcends perspective, that includes emotion and desire, but includes it in a way that doesn't juxtapose my emotions, my desires, and my reason to that of others. And so to return to my objections to the foundations of analytic philosophy, it's this, that analytic philosophy is grounded on a fundamentally first-person singular conception of agency, of belief and desire, and it attempts through the back door to bring in these other things. But because it's always through the back door, it can never actually attain what Plato and Kant were after. So that's why, on my view, all of those efforts to reconstruct Plato and Kant in those terms are failures. And that's reflected then also in the relation that philosophy has to other cultures. So everybody seems to assume that the Western culture and current American philosophy has the absolute truth, and these others are just kind of approximations that fail. Well, my view is that that's a complete historical blindness to the very real connection between the way people look at things and their socio-political, economic, and social interests.
So I have a question for anyone on the panel, and hopefully not a question that's just going to reveal I'm not trained as a rhetorician. But I think, you know, one of the things I saw that occurred across all the contributions, two things really. So one is this sort of centrality that rhetoric's about persuasion, and persuasion is productive, right? It produces things in the world. But it also seems to be that some people are kind of framing this in terms of epistemological questions. It produces knowledges, or it produces truths, or it produces positionalities that are mobilized in democratic processes, where some other contributions seem to suggest that this persuasion is being framed more in ontological terms, that it sort of frames the conditions under which humanity is possible at all, or speech acts are possible at all. And so I wondered if anyone in the panel wanted to weigh in on this sort of, is it an entanglement of epistemology and ontology? Am I revealing my lack of training in rhetoric by suggesting that these two things are perhaps existing in tension, or perhaps existing in relationality? Any comments on that?
Well, you know, in drama, there's, you know, one of the things that we say is that what you do is who you are. You know, in other words, the action a character takes defines who they are, regardless of what they look like. And I think with language, what you say is what you mean. The old thing, but when people tell you who they are, believe them the first time. You know, I think that there is this idea between the kind of the ethereality of language. You know, the kind of that it's sort of just there in the ethosphere, as opposed to the physical world we're in. Well, I think language does shape power. Language creates wars. That changes everything, doesn't it? You know, a speech can cause a war to happen. So the effect of language is it is real in it that it is how we construct meaning for ourselves internally. but it's also real in that if it is persuasive, it will have the effect of moving people to do things. And what is said is what is the direction, and what is accepted, I suppose, by the audience is the direction society will move. So I think this is the great argument that's happening right now between, for example, this campus where we have a Black Study program and Florida, where they're trying to pretend it doesn't exist as an issue at all. You know, this is a real argument about what language means, what history actually says. You know, what is true? I mean, get back to this, what is true? And I hate the what is true, because nothing is true, and that's absolutely true. Nothing is absolutely true, and that is absolutely true. But the fact of the matter is, who gets to define how we perceive truth directs how society goes. And I think that is what's real.
We've talked a lot about rhetoric as persuasion on this panel, but it's been very important for myself to actually think about rhetoric in terms of silences, in terms of absence, in terms of what is unsayable, unspeakable. And of course, this is a question about positionality, right? Because to stay in the realm of persuasion and the visible is to stay within the terms of power as they stand. And if we take from a whole legacy of thinking through questions of structure and power and the ways in which discourse congeals precisely because of the intersection of forces that allow for something to come into visibility, to come into unspeakability, then for us to be able to talk about communities in struggle, to struggle inside of communities that are trying to survive, it is absolutely necessary to shift our perspective and to not recenter the terms of visibility or speakability as they stand. So rhetoric for me is about silence.
I think that's an important intervention, because I haven't talked about rhetoric persuasion, but I should also make it clear that I feel, you know, someone like Diane Davis, who does antisocial solidarities, he says that rhetoric as persuasion is outdated, right? But we need to think of rhetoric as movement. But we need to think of rhetoric as responsibility, because the rhetoric can't produce the effects that you want to produce necessarily. You can have the affect that you want to produce. So I'm glad that you brought that up, so we can, because my notion of rhetoric, some would consider to be very conservative.
We have time for one more question, if there's a question.
I really like to hear new archives and outlaw archives and from pieces as very archives and gambling as an evaluation of knowledge. So I just kind of wanted to be curious before how your experience has been trying to bring these outlaw archives of knowledge within academia, and if Dr. Minch and the team.
So I'm going to briefly rephrase for the recording that this is a question about outlaw archives, and then I'll turn it over to the panel.
I'm pausing because my pause indicates a difficulty in bringing in outlaw archives. This is been pointed out by a couple of folks here. The very terms of what it is to have an archive introduces what it is to have an archive. So I'm not saying something that's already been said here. It's been said in a very kind of powerful way, but I like to hear other folks they want to respond to. I find that even talking about rhetoric, And that's why I'm glad we're on this panel. It's difficult because most folks are Platonists. They believe that they have the truth. And to believe in the truth is, to not believe in the truth is almost heretical for most people. My own mother told me when I told her I was going to live in Everett, she said, son, you're going to school to learn how to lie? I haven't spoken to her since. So what I'm doing here is I'm performing an archive, the archival film of how the difficulty through my reaction to our performance. That's how difficult it is. And I'll stop here. The very fact that at a Senate meeting, someone could talk about those who disagree with them is not having common sense. As being polemical, et cetera, et cetera. And our next meeting around the university that will get to that reveals how difficult it is. How can people say that in this kind of a space? So that would be my response for other folks that would.
That's an incredibly thoughtful response. And I actually just kind of want to connect Cheryl's question about, rhetoric and persuasion, this idea of rhetoric as production versus something like rhetoric as consumption, right? Like thinking about it as, thinking about what you actually consume, and how that relates to things like politics, ontology, epistemic, and I agree with Vorris. I think what you're mentioning there around silence is incredibly essential. And I think like that sort of compilation right there is really helpful for me to be able to think about this question of alternative archives or outlaw archives or whatever, because and this is where I will kind of speak a little bit to being in an English department. That one of the things that I would say is really hard to define is something like California Indian literature, and some of that has to do with the history of the study of literature, canon, kind of educational models, what is understood to be literacy, like what is like what does it mean to actually have some sort of capacity with language, right? Like all of that is, none of that's apolitical. And it really gets to a kind of question too, as to whether we are just talking about it from a critical position, right? Like, which is in some ways, one of the things it wants to do is like turn back and look at this kind of production of all of these sort of forms of knowledge, and to do it from a critical angle that, can sort of take it apart, but that creates a new form of mastery, right? And a new sort of like archive. And so I think that the question of outlaw archive for me is about how to think about things that have been excluded without trying to think through the means of inclusion themselves as something that would contribute to their being sort of incorporated into that process of mastery. We don't want to master, right? Like how is it that we actually submit in some ways to those things in a much more, for lack of a clear term, a kind of weak epistemological perspective, something that would actually attend to the silences or the absences of the sayable, something that would both, not necessarily be subjected to the need to make them sensical or commonsensical, and to open to that possibility that in fact they might not make sense, and that's totally fine. And so we don't need necessarily to recreate the value of what's sensical and nonsense. So like doing that kind of work is a way that we can to attend to like even like what constitutes California literature as something that's as widely varied as and this is I'm going to speak a little bit to Deborah Miranda, the word we'll call bad Indians, right? Badness, the most important term there, of the ways that Indigenous people who are confronted with the system to try to record their knowledge did it in ways that were not necessarily recognizable, and yet that becomes a form of literature, right? It becomes something that's really important. So yeah, that's my.
Thank you, everyone.